from the ashes, you have broken every curse. Blessed Redeemer, you have set this captive free. Lord, I can't help but sing. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. Who am I that the highest King would welcome me? I was lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love for me. Oh, his love for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. Free at last, he has ransomed me. His grace runs deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, he died for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. Oh, I am who you say I am. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am.
The incredible story of the Apostle Paul's shipwreck comes to a conclusion at the end of Acts chapter 27. After an incredible over 2-week journey through a raging typhoon, literally described as the devil's storm in Luke's original writing, that's the term that the locals use to describe such a monstrous storm. After they survive that in the fulfillment of God's promise that they all come to the beach, then we find the Apostle Paul and those with him being able to safely be brought to land. So chapter 28 then continues with what happens as they finally make landfall. Luke writes, when they had been brought safely through. This is another one of those very descriptive terms. The typhoon would have sent a raging surf upon the coastline and upon this beach. This would not have been a simple, let's have a nice swim and then let's wade out of the water and get to dry land. Remember that there are those who can swim, make a try for the beach, and then those who cannot are holding on to debris of the ship. So even pieces of the ship are being shattered and broken and shoved up against this beach and coastline. Anything else that has been uprooted during this storm along that part of the Mediterranean is also going to be washing up upon this shoreline. So imagine trying to get through a surf where waves are piling up that may be, even if they were 10 feet tall, and they would have likely been much bigger than that in terms of height and volume and just sheer power, just slamming on your back and slamming you to the ground and knocking you off your feet and trying to sweep you back out in between waves. And then all the debris around you tumbling and churning. And so Luke says, having been brought safely through, because the surf line would have been the red zone. It would have been the danger zone. To just get through that without injury is absolutely incredible. He continues, and then we found out that the island was called Malta. Now, whether the natives mentioned in the next verse tell them where they are, or likely the experienced navigators and sailors among them recognize it once they make landfall. Remember, for more than 2 weeks, they have not had any of their navigational signs in terms of the sun or the stars and their relative location. They've not seen the sky for over 2 weeks with the raging storm. The fact that it's been raining heavily is going to be mentioned in just a few verses, which would also obscure their view of the coastline. Just seeing that calm stretch in the foaming white water of those huge waves slamming against that rocky coastline is what they have aimed for. Now, there's nearby where they have been beached or where they've run aground and then been brought safely through is the harbor of Valletta, which to this day is a major harbor of the island. This is a known harbor for those that would be sailing back and forth this route from Alexandria to Rome and so on. This is a common stop, and they will, in fact, in verse 11 and following, when they disembark from the island, they will get passage on another Alexandrian grain ship that had wintered there in the harbor. So likely even the navigators who are familiar with this route would know this coastline and would know this island. In any case, they don't discover exactly where they are until they're standing on terra firma, if you will. In verse 2, Luke continues, the natives showed us extraordinary kindness. The word for native is an interesting word. It's literally the word barbarian. But Luke is not indicating that somehow these are a type of indigenous people who have no education and who eat one another or whatever. That in the first century world, there are three kinds of people, certainly from a Jewish perspective, as Luke is writing from. There are Jews, there are Greeks, and then there are barbarians. Paul uses the same word in 1 Corinthians 14 to talk about a language that you don't know. He calls them barbars or barbarians because that's what the language would sound like to you if you didn't know it. So if you are a Jew, you, of course, know Hebrew and its relative Aramaic, and then most folks would know Greek. Greek was the international trade language of the day. And then once you move outside of that, it's just all the different possible tongues that are spoken by folks around the world. And so these that do not speak Hebrew and they do not speak Greek, Well, it's because the island of Malta was a Polynesian colony, and so they would have spoke the language of Phoenicia, not even of Rome. They showed us extraordinary kindness. Luke uses a combination of words that they really went well beyond what was expected or what could be considered. They went far beyond that, and he says, "For because of the rain that had set in, and because of the cold, they kindled a fire and received us all." Remember, we're talking about, according to chapter 27 and verse 37, 276 people. Now, that's a large crowd caring for, clothing, feeding, housing. 276 people is significant. That's no small thing. And so they start a large fire. People are wet. People are cold. Hypothermia can set in. And what's interesting about hypothermia is it doesn't have to be Arctic temperatures in order to suffer from hypothermia. If the water's just cooler than your body temperature, that 98.6 degrees, you can be in 80-degree water, and if you're in it long enough, it can begin to bring your body core temperature down. Well, it's certainly a lot colder than 80 degrees in the very late fall in the Mediterranean in a storm. They're wet and they're cold. Verse 3, "But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire." Paul is one of the most powerful personalities in the group. Oh, you have the Roman centurion. He certainly demands much respect. But the Apostle Paul has been a voice that first warned them not to travel during this season, and then assured them that they would survive. And then he's the guy that in the middle of the raging typhoon with a doomed and failing ship called them to the deck to eat one last meal before daybreak and the run for the beach. So this is the man that they watched, thank God, even in such dire circumstances. So he certainly has everyone's attention as a man of great stature, that he is a tremendous leader. But the other thing that's significant here is for all of that, Paul is gathering wood like everybody else. He is not demanding to be treated like royalty or somehow to be treated special. They're not carrying him around on a pillow. They're not waving a palm leaf over him. He's gathering wood like others for the fire. And so in this service, something really interesting happens. As he dropped the wood into the fire, Luke says that a viper came out because of the heat and fastened itself on his hand. Since snakes are cold-blooded creatures, when it does get cold outside, they become very slow and lethargic. And so it makes absolute perfect sense that being gathered up in the wood, the snake just wouldn't have a whole lot of interest or activity. But then as it gets to the heat of the fire or just realizes it's going to get burned and goes ahead and summons the energy and panics, the viper strikes Paul and is hanging from his hand. In verse 4, when the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they began saying to one another, "Undoubtedly, this man is a murderer, and though he has been saved from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." This isn't really so much a superstition. That's going to be described a little bit later. But I would argue sort of common sense, because we often today use the word fate in terms of justice. The way Luke writes this, there is a possibility that there is one of the Roman gods who's considered the personification or the goddess of justice. It could be. That's a little bit of a stretch. That's not something we typically see Luke reference. But it's what's in their mind, and so we're doing a little mind reading based on what Luke has said. But it's kind of the common man's reaction is, man, you just survived an absolute tragic shipwreck and then got through this surf. Because remember, the surf would be booming and pounding and just foaming all around. Which would have been frightening, and it would be shaking. Those waves would be shaking and causing the beach to vibrate, just the power and the strength. So for them to say they survived all this storm out in the middle of that sea, and then survived the shipwreck, where literally the ship's, whatever's left of it, is there in pieces coming ashore, to survive the storm and not be sunk and drowned out in the middle of the sea, to survive the coming ashore, only to be bitten by a poisonous snake. Boy, you must have really, really done something wrong. You really must be evil. And so murderer, the taking of human life, is an obvious worst-case scenario that they have to assume that Paul has really done something bad. But what happens in verse 5, however, Paul shook the creature off into the fire and suffered no harm. So the snake's hanging on his arm, and he shakes it off in the fire. That brings the snake to its demise, and then everybody else sits back to wait for Paul to die. The modern mind is an interesting thing. It is incredible how arrogant we can be in the assumption that if we don't know about it or if we haven't seen it, it cannot possibly exist or have happened. So there are some critics today that wonder about the authenticity or the accuracy of this account, because the point is made that there are no known poisonous vipers on the island of Malta, and there are very, very limited woods in order to harvest enough wood to have a fire. There are just not a lot of trees. It's a real rocky island. And so here's, for example, a modern picture of not just the Isle of Malta, but here specifically the harbor of Valletta. We'll talk a little more about this harbor. You can already see how deep the harbor goes back and then has these various cuts along the way, which is why this is such a famous harbor and why it was so popular or common for ships to winter there, because as you have these ferocious storms coming out of the northeast, there are all kinds of places to anchor and be protected by this particular shoreline. But the reason why I show you this picture is I hope you can make out how crowded this place is. And it is built up by, of course, there's a modern population, but it is built up by ancient stones, first a Phoenician colony, and then it becomes fortified by Rome, because it is such a common harbor along the route from Rome to the south and the east regions of the Mediterranean. When England takes over, they do a lot of fortification of this particular city. Just to show you, probably back this up a little bit. But here's a shot looking across the throat of that harbor at how fortified this city is. And England put in all kinds of guns to guard this particular harbor. So we'll back up just a little bit. And so the modern mind says, wow, there's no known poisonous vipers or snakes, and how would you find enough trees to have enough wood to have a fire like this? Again, the modern mind is spectacularly arrogant. So first of all, in modern times and in recent history, absolutely that's a fact, but when you consider that it is so built up, where would a snake live? The native habitat has long since been built up and inhabited by humans. And humans tend to want to run off poisonous snakes. There's a place in Sweetwater, Texas. The reason for the roundup in the 50s began because we have too many rattlesnakes in our front yards in town. Let's start gathering them up and see if we can get them out of town. That's what people do. So, number one, the island is greatly built up in recent history, which means that would eliminate or compete with the snake's natural habitat. Number two, people cut down the trees for firewood a long time ago in recent history. But even as we speculate, okay, so say roughly 2,000 years ago, the island of Malta would not be near as developed. There wouldn't be near as much wood cutting and so on. But also let us remember that this story, this account takes place at the end of a major typhoon that is blowing debris from the east to the west onto the shores of this island. Even lakes, but if you go to any coastline, any sea coast, you will always find driftwood, because there is always floating debris that is washed up on the beach from whatever the latest either high tide event or great storm. So you can go along some coastlines, and after a storm comes through, you might have all manner of marine life, like you might have crabs and starfish and seashells and even fish that are washed up on the beach and are now stranded. You're going to get kelp and aquatic plant life washed up, jellyfish washed up, trees, logs, all kinds of debris will wash up on a beach. So even if Malta 2,000 years ago didn't have a significant snake or tree population, it's not a stretch at all to see how they could build a fire out of the driftwood, and if nothing else, pieces of the ship would work, this wooden ship that is so broken up, people have floated ashore on the debris. And then thirdly, it is a common occurrence for various critters to ride drifting debris in the storm to strange shorelines. That is the most common way that botanists and biologists will describe how a population of one kind of animal can migrate or populate some strange isolated island. It's just pretty normal for there to be critters that get, maybe you got a good old snake hanging on a limb on the beach, minding his own business, and he gets washed off, or the tree becomes uprooted, or he's further up the river in his favorite tree in a jungle, and those heavy rains bring a flood and high winds, and he's either blown off or his favorite tree up the river is uprooted and it falls in the river, it floats down the river, it floats out to sea and drifts all the way to Malta. That's what happens. So this is not a difficulty in any means if we would just allow the text to speak. Well, that's not Luke's point, is the origin of the viper, but rather that folks recognize it as a poisonous viper. They know what that snake is. It's not like, oh, I wonder if that was a garter snake. I wonder. They are expecting him to die, so that snake is common to them. So either it is or was native to that island, or it was fairly common for them to drift in from somewhere else. So they recognize the snake, and they expect Paul to die at any moment. Verse 6 says, but they were expecting that he was about to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. So they not only know that it is a poisonous snake, but they know it is one that acts rapidly. However, verse 5, he shook the creature off. In verse 6, waiting for him to fall down dead. But after they had waited a long time and have seen nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and began to say that he was a god. So the first idea is, well, he survived the storm, he survived the shipwreck, he survived the coming ashore, only to die by snake. He must be a pretty rotten fellow. Now it turns into he survived everything. He survived the storm, he survived the shipwreck, he survived the surf, he survived the snake. He is unbeatable, that he has power over death, because here's all the ways he should have died, but he hasn't. Therefore, he must be over death, so that makes him a god. That's certainly one way to consider the evidence, and they're on the right track. The reason that Paul is alive is because of God, not because Paul is a god. So they're getting closer. Then in verse 7, now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the leading man of the island named Publius, who welcomed us and entertained us courteously 3 days. On 3 different occasions, Luke is going to describe how these people received them with such kindness and generosity and compassion. So it takes about 3 days. Remember, we're talking 276 people. That's a pretty good crowd. So they, right there on the beach, build a fire and no doubt help them dry their clothes and bring perhaps some food or whatever they could get just in the immediate vicinity. But then for 3 days, he's going to take care of them while they get things settled. According to verse 11, they're going to remain on that island for 3 months. One, their ship is gone. Two, they are in the heart, in the middle of the most dangerous time to travel, as they have just demonstrated. So there are other shipping, or there is other shipping available from that island, but no one's sailing during that time of year because they don't want to experience what has just been experienced by these men. In verse 8, it happened that the father of Publius was lying in bed, afflicted with recurrent fever and dysentery. And as we know, generally a fever is a sign of infection, and then dysentery is a similar sign of infection somewhere in the bowels and can lead to, pretty quickly, the real serious problem of dehydration. Nowadays, it's interesting if someone has a fairly serious case of dysentery or diarrhea, that within a matter of days, they may be admitted to the hospital and administered fluids by IV. It's just that important that you don't become dehydrated because it gets serious quickly, and that's where this man's father is. So Paul went in to see him, and after he had prayed, he laid his hands on him and healed him. Luke has shown this before, but it's worth remembering that the power to heal is not in Paul. Remember, the natives just said, "Oh, he must be a god." This reminds us of an experience Paul's already had, where they thought he and Barnabas were gods and first tried to worship them, and then they ended up stoning them. So what Luke points out is before Paul heals someone, because he doesn't actually heal anyone, God does. Now, God chooses Paul as the vessel, or uses Paul's hands, if you will, to bring the healing. But Paul prays first. Paul doesn't know if he's going to be able to heal. It's not on automatic. It's not just whenever he wants to, that's what he does. So this is how Paul begins the process, is he asks God for his help, that it would be his will. He prays first, laid his hands on him, and healed him. After this had happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases were coming to him and getting cured. They also honored us with many marks of respect, and when we were setting sail, they supplied us with all we needed. Well, verse 10 encompasses what verse 11 says, and after 3 months we set sail on an Alexandrian ship. God is doing amazing things. Because of how God is working through Paul, the way people see him or respect him, they certainly listen to him, because the witness of the gospel here is incredibly powerful, and it could not have been lost on them that Paul is actually a prisoner en route to Rome. That's why the Roman centurion is there and his soldiers. It also would have been really fascinating for the Roman centurion and his soldiers. Remember, the soldiers were thinking about just killing all the prisoners when the ship was beginning to break up after it had run aground, and the centurion stopped it. They're continuing to have the opportunity to see what kind of man the Apostle Paul is, that he's not trying to run off and hide in the brush at every opportunity to try to escape, but that he is serving. He encouraged them on the ship and told them to eat, and then he was carrying wood like everybody else. They too witnessed the snake episode, or certainly heard about it pretty quickly if they weren't standing right there around the first couple of rings of folks around the fire. And then they continued to see how Paul is loving and serving, and now all these miracles that he's doing, and it certainly draws a crowd. So they're going to spend 3 months. They will sail out of this harbor, and as we've mentioned, this is a very common harbor. This is Valletta, and you can see again from all the cuts, all the opportunities for safe haven or protection whenever the storm rolls in. Here's a close-up of the entrance as a modern cruise line is coming in, and you can see how, not just how built up it is and how protected it is from the element, but when England came in and fortified it even more beyond what first Phoenicia and Rome had done, you see the stone jetties and you see the guard castles or the structures that have been built. Because in order to invade, so they're going to come in either by sail or they're going to be hand rowing, so they're going to be fairly slow. And as they come in, that's going to expose them to the defenses around the city. So if you look across at this particular spot, here's a close-up, just to give you a picture of the stonework that dates back centuries and centuries and centuries. and how you're going to have these firing positions, both cannons to fire at the ships, to deter them or to sink them, like you see in this particular picture. Here's some of the cannons that still remain there to this day. So if you come in through the middle, you're going to have a crossfire from the cannons on this side and those on that side. And then if you try to get into a smaller boat for the actual invasion, now you're going to have, first it would have been archers, then by the time you get to England, you're going to have riflemen and musketeers and the smaller hand cannons. You're going to have a lot of defenses that are very well protected and that are at a high elevation firing down. So the island of Malta becomes a fortress on the trade route from Alexandria to Rome. And so here they're going to spend 3 months waiting for the weather to change as they continue this journey. Now, you remember that the reason that Paul went to Macedonia is because God had showed him a vision. Or you remember how earlier even in Acts, how Cornelius was praying and an angel let him know that he would need to send a messenger to a fellow named Simon or look for Peter, and how Peter was given the vision of the sheep being lowered 3 times with the various kinds of animals to prepare him to go to Cornelius's house. All of that happened in Peter's life because Cornelius, a devout man, was praying to God, and so God sent Cornelius the messenger through Peter. Well, I think it's pretty fascinating that it's very likely that there is someone in Malta that's been praying. Jesus said earlier in Matthew 7 that if we ask, we will receive. If we seek, we find. If we knock, it will be opened. That he will reveal himself to us. Later, Paul himself preached in Acts 17 that we grope for God as though he is far from us, though he's right here with us. Well, the folks in Malta needed to hear about Jesus and needed the opportunity to be saved. That's not a big deal for God. Paul's already on an all-expense-paid cruise from Caesarea to Rome. Doesn't have to spend a dime. In fact, he's got 2 companions, Luke and Aristarchus, with him. So all God has to do is just whip up a little typhoon, blow them completely off course for 2 weeks, create a pretty receptive audience of 276 people that are looking for God and needing some religion in their life while their ship is coming apart, which gives Paul the opportunity to give thanks from this doomed deck of a breaking up ship so that he can come ashore and get bit by a snake and not die. You might say that Paul was snake bit. Everything seemed to go wrong, and it's exactly what God was using. Remember, at any time, he could have been complaining about this isn't right, this isn't fair, why have I been arrested, I hadn't even gotten a fair trial. But Paul has seen it as an opportunity to talk about Jesus to governors and to kings, as Jesus promised his disciples would take place. That's what Paul has the opportunity to do. He even said, I wish you were like me, except for these chains, when he talks to the king Agrippa and the Roman governor Felix. Now that he's on the shore, and as the snake drops off and people begin to wonder about who he is, and then he prays to God, and God gives him the ability, the power to heal all these people, Malta becomes a fortress of Christianity. There is a tremendous conversion that happens there, and then through the early centuries, the church fathers talk about the brethren in Malta. So all along the way, God is using Paul in amazing, unexpected ways to bring about his purpose. It would have been interesting to watch Paul's face when he looks at the snake hanging on his hand. Obviously, Paul knows that he's saved, so he could have been thinking, oh well, it was a good run while it lasted, I'm going home. He would write to the Corinthian brethren that we groan in this tent for our homecoming, or to be absent from the bodies, to be home with the Lord, 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Or when he writes the Philippian church, he said, I'm hard-pressed whether to go to be with Christ or remain here with you. To live is Christ, die is gain. But we do know he's still living in the promise that he must stand before Caesar's court. That's why he's not afraid of the shipwreck, and that's not why he's going to be afraid of the snake, because, didn't see that coming, but he's still got to go to Rome, so this can't be the end. No matter where we are and what is going on, may we look up or may we pause enough to ask the Lord, what is it that you would want for me to do today? Or how is it that I can serve you today, even when I don't know how the journey ends? We know where the end is, but what happens between now and then, that's up to God. May we be encouraged by Paul's example.
The ground began to shake, the stone was rolled away. His perfect love could not be overcome. Now death, where is your sting? Our resurrected King has rendered you defeated. Forever He is glorified. Forever He is lifted high. Forever He is risen. He is alive. He is alive. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. Forever He is glorified. Forever He is lifted high. Forever He is risen. He is alive. He is alive. He is alive.